Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us and welcome to At Your Service with Haber and Martinez, episode number 14, which we have entitled Dope, Drugs, and Narcotics. Today, I'm Mike Haber. Many of you know me. You know my associate and friend and companion and co-conspirator, Ed Martinez. And we have a special guest with us today who I'll introduce shortly. But before I do, let's talk a little bit about today's topic. Some people define drugs as humanity's way of borrowing happiness from the future at a high interest rate. But really, when we talk about it, we're talking about substances that alter one's physical, mental, or emotional state. No matter what your definition or rationale, regardless of whether they're used recreationally or in a controlled fashion, it doesn't matter if they're over-the-counter prescription or even illegally required, whether organic, man-made, domestic, imported, smuggled, be them in pill, powder, liquid, or smokable form, there is a common denominator that they all share, and that is the effects. The effects of drugs hit all of us, every one of us, whether we're users or not, one way or another. So today we're going to be talking about many different topics related to narcotics, including various nefarious crime figures that hit our local community, like Willie Falcone and Sal Magluta. We may get into a discussion about the Miami River cops. We'll talk about some more infamous characters that maybe did not directly, but certainly indirectly affected us, like Pablo Escobar, the Cali cartel, other drug cartels. We'll talk about law enforcement and their role in the war on drugs, this never-ending battle. From interdiction to sting operations to reverse sting operations to street-level drug busts. We'll talk about tactics that law enforcement uses, how they work up the ladder, federal, state, municipal task forces, concepts such as flipping subjects, interrogations, tacking on of gratuitous charges, forfeiture, all sorts of different tricks and tips that they have. We're going to get into confidential informants and confidential sources, the how, what, and why of them. We'll talk about defending drug cases, things like police misconduct, entrapment, illegal searches and seizures, chain of custody, lack of knowledge or intent, cooperation and substantial assistance, and time permitting, we'll get into a little bit about regulation, decriminalization, and legalization. So as we start off, let me introduce our special guest, Nick Delguidice. Nick is a retired Miami-Dade County police officer. He was with the county for 26 years, I believe. And I believe 14 of those years, the last 14, he was specifically assigned to the Narcotics Division. He's a highly trained and experienced law enforcement officer who's now retired and living La Vita Dolce in South Florida with his beautiful family. And we are privileged and proud and honored to have him with us. Nick, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. Looking forward to talking to you guys.
Good to see you, Nick.
Thanks.
You guys too, man. It's really nice.
So I met Nick through Ed. Ed, as you all, if you've watched before, you know. If you don't know, then let me remind you, early on in his career, Ed was a prosecutor here in Miami-Dade County. He worked in Kathy Rundle's office, and he worked his way up through the ranks and got a specialty assignment in the Narcotics Division. Before you get specialty assigned as a prosecutor, you have all sorts of cases. You handle everything. Depending on, your judge, your division, you basically have a wide swath of cases. But when you show a particular penchant for one area, if you're good enough and talented enough, you get promoted, as Ed did. And so he had the privilege.
Or you give the chief a huge check. No, I'm kidding.
One of the two. But Ed had the privilege of serving in that capacity. And in that capacity, since he did nothing but, for a period of time, narcotics prosecutions, he got to work very closely with many narcotics detectives. And again, same thing with the detectives, right? Most police officers, they start, they beat cops, they do everything from traffic tickets to any kind of call or what have you. But it's not unless you show a certain penchant and ability and commitment that you get a specialty assignment like Nick had into narcotics. So before I turn everything over and we have more of a group, let me just wrap it up by saying you've got three people on your screen. And so you've got three different points of view when we talk about dope, drugs, and narcotics. You've got Nick in his extensive experience as a law enforcement officer. doing busts, securing warrants, setting up stings, all of the types of things that we're going to talk about from his angle proactively as a law enforcement officer. You've got Ed, who, although now he's a defense attorney and does some civil practice as well, but we've got his experience as a narcotics prosecutor who handled those cases on behalf of the state of Florida. And then I am the wily defense attorney who has the final perspective of how do we deal with cops like Nick and prosecutors like Ed.
Well,
So
prosecutors and cops like Nick, you're screwed. Prosecutors like me and cops like Nick, you're screwed. However, we all know, Nick, there's some prosecutors who are not that good and some undercover narcotics detectives that just sometimes gave the defense openings, both parties. So just got to throw that in.
Well, why don't we start with a discussion, if we can? Let's run up the ladder. Let's talk a little bit about the history. I mean, just briefly. Everybody probably has heard of Willie and Sal. You've probably seen the Cocaine Cowboys on Netflix. I mean, these are two local kids that grew up right here in Miami and became major narcotics traffickers, global level narcotics traffickers, right? And then, of course, you've got, the Pablo Escobars and the cartels of the world that have their fingers all over South Florida and, frankly, the rest of the country and the rest of the world. And that's really how we, in a way, launched into the era of the war on drugs, right? I mean, people have been using controlled substances in one form or another since biblical time.
What do you think about that, Nick? When you first started, let me ask you that. When you first started in narcotics, was Willie and Sal still around, or had they already gone down?
Now, I went to the Narcotics Bureau in 1994. They were already
They were already in federal custody.
Yeah, they're already going through the system. Okay,
right.
These guys were being prosecuted. They're being sentenced or whatever. So we didn't deal with that. My tenure in narcotics was more on a local level, anyways. Although within our bureau, we had groups that were signed to the federal task force. We had state task force with Florida Department of Law Enforcement. Our group worked mostly just the local areas and dealt with the local drug distributions.
Right. So the audience can understand, and I know a little bit about the history of this. When the Willies and the Sals, and the guys actually came before them, but Willie and Sal were the first ones. The reason that there was a declared war on drugs is they started using boats and equipment that law enforcement could not compete. Much like Al Capone back in the 20s. When they first started using Tommy guns, the police department was very undermanned, and that's why they brought in Elliot Ness, and then the police department started using assault rifles and started using Tommy guns. The war started because the police, let me finish, Mike. The war started because the police department needed the money to get boats that they could chase these cigarette boats with, and they could catch them. But once Sal and Willie got arrested, now we had all the other guys that have been riding on their coattails, hanging around. And that's why we needed guys like Nick locally to start taking some of these guys down. Is that about right, Nick?
Well, you pretty much hit it. Once those drugs came into the country, they had to be distributed.
Right.
That's when we started seeing it. We're starting to go out into the neighborhoods. And we're not just talking small amounts. They're going out in kilos. Large amounts of drugs are being distributed all over South Florida. That's where we came in. We were multi-agencies. Different departments.
Right. And going back to something you said earlier, Mike, what happens is when you start out as a prosecutor, the cops are similar, but when you start out as a prosecutor, you're in a division and you're getting the cases given to you, right? So cops show up on the scene, narcotic prosecutors first. The cases are already arrested. People are arrested. The cops have taken them to jail. Then they get to the state attorney's office. You're stuck with whatever the cop did on the scene with his probable cause. When you get into a special unit as a prosecutor, and I'll start with that first, we work hand in hand developing investigations together. And Nick, as a cop, same thing. When you're a cop, you go out to the scene and you're stuck with what's there. But as an undercover cop, you get targets and you say, okay, we know that guy because he's smart. He knows what he's doing. He's either been through the system, he's got money. It's hard to catch that guy making a mistake. We got to do a proactive investigation. And that's really what I loved about being a special unit prosecutor. The beauty of coming together with the cops and creating an investigation and getting all the information, which Nick will probably tell you, I was one of those that felt like Nick had not done his job until he gave me enough evidence that I could prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt before we even make the arrest. That's really the goal of a special prosecutor. We're not just somebody who's just trying to see if we can get lucky. We're there to make sure that if we arrest somebody, much like the feds, we've got them. And then it's tougher for Mike or me now on the defense to try and defeat those cases. And that's why you're out there and something like that happens to you and you got a special unit prosecutor, you better make sure you hire a lawyer who knows exactly what he's doing. Because chances are, guys like Nikki and I, when we were working together, we got your client. We got him. We got him cornered and there's no way out. Am I right? Nikki's laughing, but am I right, Nick?
You said it, buddy. I remember sitting down and saying, okay, where are we at with this case? What do we need to do? Okay, what evidence do we really need to get this case prosecuted?
And so let's give them a little insight. Mike, if you don't mind, let's give them a little insight. So let's say Nikki would call me and he'd say, this is what I've got. And I say, Nick, I don't think that's enough to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Can you get me this? And Nikki might say, well, I can't. I know, I'd love to, but I can't because the guy's doing this. And I say, well, shit, I need that. So how are we going to get that? Can we do this? Let's do that. How about this, Nick? Do you know somebody who might know him? How about, can we get somebody to do so we start brainstorming on how to catch the really tough criminals to catch. Right, Nick?
Oh, absolutely. I remember cases working with you, specific cases. I mean, whenever you're ready.
Mike is laughing. I want to see what the
I was laughing because when you first started talking about the reason for the war on drugs and, you know, the fast speedboats and this and that, it reminded me of the line that Tony Montana says to Sosa when they're in Bolivia, right? And they're negotiating the price. And he says, 13.5 a key. What are you, nuts? We still got to take that shit to Florida. You know what it's like these days? The U.S. Navy all over the place. You got the Frogman, EC-2 aircraft with the satellite tracking shit, Bell 209 assault choppers up our ass. I said, that's exactly correct. And that's why we have our forfeiture laws that we have. I mean, a lot of the drug money actually funds the drug interdiction.
Correct.
Absolutely.
That's what they were trying to do with the forfeiture laws.
Absolutely.
And Nikki was involved in that. Nick, I don't know if this is an appropriate time, but do you want to talk about some of that? I mean, we hadn't talked in a while, but in preparation for this, we talked, and I remember that when you had a huge case. I think it was called Centro Español. Was that what it was called?
Well, that's a special case because it was a case that started from a letter. And I was sent to the chief's office.
You're breaking up there a little. You're breaking up a little, Nick. It started with a letter. What?
Can you hear me now?
A little bit better.
Okay. It started with a letter that generated itself to the chief's office that came down to the Narcotics Bureau. And then when it was presented to me, I said, I really don't want to take this case. You know, it's some people selling drugs in a local strip club or dance club or somebody else. Long story short, I didn't have a choice. So I got to sign the case.
Oh, really? I didn't know that part. See, the audience will understand something. This case was considered such a big case that the chief of narcotics actually was the one handling this case with Nikki. But, you know, my office was right next to him. At that point, I had already been in the unit for 3 years. So I was like one of the senior people, if not the senior prosecutor in narcotics. So we would brainstorm. He would ask me questions. I knew Nick was doing it. And I was kind of like the Robin to the Batman, right? I was there if he needed me, if Paul, the chief of narcotics, wasn't around. But tell us a little bit about what happened with that case.
Well, some legal issues came into play here. The complaint was, being that it was a strip club, girls stripping for money, whatever, they were selling the drugs. That's what the complaint was. So I went in there, we sent in some informants, we sent some undercover officers to make buys, and they were making buys left and right. They're buying from these dancers. They're security guards, they're there, armed guards in uniform. They're watching this going on.
Really?
Prostitution is wide open going on here. We're watching all this stuff.
No, you're breaking up pretty bad now.
He's breaking up really bad, but I'll tell you, he's giving me some thoughts about what I'm thinking about for this weekend. I mean, this sounds like the place to be.
They're close.
You kidding me?
Can you hear me?
Oh, trust me. Nikki shut him down.
Can you hear me?
You keep your audio is going in and out, Nick.
It cuts in and out.
I don't know
what it is, but
do with it. It might be up too far away.
Smack it.
I'll get a little
That's
closer.
what I do.
I'll get a little closer. Can
well,
you hear me?
let me direct you a little bit since you said something I think the audience might be interested in. When I get clients, Michael, you get them too, and when we're just talking to people in social settings, they always ask. Sometimes they'll ask me about a confidential informant, and they don't really know how that works, and when do they use an undercover and when do they use a confidential. And Nick, if you want to explain to them why a lot of times in narcotics you need the confidential informant, but the goal for the prosecutor and the narcotics detectives is to eventually get the confidential informant out of the picture. But sometimes it's necessary to use them. And give us a little insight into that, Nick.
We use confidential informants pretty much to sending them into a situation just like this. To go into this club on this particular time, taking that confidential informant with an undercover detective. So we're killing two birds with one stone, the introduction with the confidential informant. Now the officer is making the buys.
Right.
Now we got direct
You're
buys.
breaking up, Nick. So let me fill in the gaps. I'll fill in the gaps. I know where we're at. So you notice how he said to make the introduction, and you heard that part. What happens is a lot of these guys, remember, this is not your street level idiot. These are guys that know what they're doing, and they know the cops are looking, and they don't want to get arrested. So when they see a face they don't recognize, a lot of times it's hard. They're not going to sell to them. And of course, the narcotics detectives try to look like Serpico as best they can. But we're at a different level now. The times have changed. They're not stupid. They're not going to sell to somebody they don't know. So the real goal is to use a confidential informant to introduce the undercover. So Nicky would come in with a CI, and he'd introduce Nicky as his cousin or his best bud who just moved to Florida from, California or whatever. So now the CI makes a buy with Nicky standing right there. And hopefully it gives them a little bit of confidence thinking, well, the guy saw me sell, coke to this guy, to the CI. He didn't arrest me. I guess he's cool. After Nicky does that 2 or 3 times, and the CI says, hey, Nicky's going to come get it for me next time. Is that cool? And then the guy says, yeah, Nick's in. Right, Nick?
So I want to chime in on something
Hit it on the head.
to make sure the audience understands. When we talk about CIs or CSs, confidential informants or confidential sources, they come in a bunch of different varieties, okay? But basically what you're dealing with is a non-law enforcement person, a civilian, somebody who does not have a badge, a gun, or a law enforcement certification, at least not anymore. Maybe they did once. But generally they're civilians. And these people, for any of a variety of reasons, are working with the police. It may be because they themselves have been arrested and they're trying to mitigate their own exposure. It may be because they were entrenched in a lifestyle that surrounded them with people involved in the drug trade that gave them knowledge and an opportunity to profit off of it. So we call those folks paid informants. They're not necessarily working off the case for themselves, but they are working, and they're actually working for profit, be it a flat payment or a payment in a percentage basis or off of the amount of the drugs or seizures. And then there are Dudley Do-Right citizens, right? People who just have no horse in the race at all, other than they want to be involved, or they're wannabe cops, right?
Nick will tell you, Nick, have you ever worked with the third case scenario? Some guy who's didn't get arrested and wasn't entrenched in the drug world that all of a sudden just wanted to be, Captain America?
Shied away from people like that. Straight, I just understand.
Shy away from that.
Yeah, I didn't know.
Right, but I've had it, so I know it exists.
Wow.
Okay.
It's just another category, but I would say the vast majority of CIs are people who have been arrested and are working off their own time or working off time for somebody else, right?
And there's a reason for that, because they're more legit. They actually were in the underworld and they can open doors because they've been there before and people trust them. That's why typically, a guy like Nick,
But how does a CI become a CI?
Well, again, he could have gotten arrested.
He gets arrested and he wants to work.
Yeah, he gets arrested and he's got a choice. You can cooperate, and I can put in a good word to the state attorney's office in reference to your cooperation, which might help you in the future, without making any promises. without saying I can do this, that. Talk to the state attorney's office, and we can talk about your case. Talk about how you can help us. You get a proffer. In other words, you talk to the state attorney's office and me. What can you do for us?
Right.
Can
But
you bring in
sometimes
felony?
you get confidential. Sometimes you get CIs, confidential sources, that are never arrested. And I have seen this happen time and time again. It happens a lot with juveniles. But I had recently a young 20s client who was on the autism spectrum. He's got Asperger's. He's high functioning, but you know, he's got his issues. And he got pulled over, and the police smelled pot in the car, and he fessed up to the pot. And the police said to him, look, you know, you have two choices. You can either help us to get the person that you get your pot from, or we're going to have to arrest you and prosecute you. And they scared the crap out of the kid, sent him home, didn't arrest him, didn't write him up, didn't do anything, said, we'll be in touch. He told his parents what happened. They got in touch with me. And then before the police could get in touch with him, I reached out to them and said, you realize you just torqued the kid with Asperger's. And, you know, if this thing goes any further, I'll be speaking to, you know, your superiors, the state attorney's office, and the judge. And that thing got dropped immediately. I mean, they never pursued it. I never even got a return call. But
Nicky would never do something like that. Nick would never do
something like that. But there are plenty of law enforcement officers that do it, because this is not with the Asperger's component, but this is a very routine situation that I see frequently, where a basic traffic stop turns into somebody wearing a wire to go do a controlled buy.
Nick, you want to take that? How often did you do that without the state attorney's office approval, if ever?
I would never. And there were a couple instances where we didn't arrest somebody, but there's a procedure for that. You call
Correct.
the state attorney's office and you say, listen, here's what I got. Can we hold back the charges on this? And I'm remembering back, I remember once or twice we were able to do something like that. And then, of course, these meetings come in. That guy's got to come in and talk to the state attorney's office. What are we doing here? And then that's just gone down.
And they become, these individuals become, I use the word legitimized with parentheses. They become legitimized as CIs, meaning they're documented. There's a file opened on them. They're assigned a confidential informant number or whatever designation the particular agency uses. And then these people are entered into a registry so that if and when a wily defense attorney gets involved, you guys are able to dot your I's and cross your T's, hopefully for you.
Yeah. You train them, right, Nick? You got to let them know what to do, how to do it, what's considered in traffic.
Absolutely. We have to know exactly what this person can do. And then our investigation surrounds that. And also understand something. You sign up, like you say, you sign this guy up for a contract. Let's say he agrees to do, and the state attorney's office, we all get together. Let's say he agrees that he already has to do 5 trafficking cases or 5 felony cases. That's part of the contract. When he's finished doing those, and he's done them successfully without issue, then the state attorney and I would sit down and says, what kind of sentence is recommended here? What do we need to do here? Those situations.
But also, you're breaking up, so let me fill in the blanks. Keep your train of thought on what you wanted to follow up, but so everybody can follow. What Nick is saying is this is a situation where somebody actually did get arrested. Now, I, as a state attorney, I never, never, listen to me carefully, never once approved not arresting someone. Never. I never did it with misdemeanors. So everybody that they ever tried this with was somebody who got a felony amount of drugs on them. And my thought always was, I've got nothing to control this person with. He's already proven that he'll commit crimes. He's already proven that he likes to follow outside of the rules and the law. So how can I leave this guy out there? Sooner or later, he's going to screw this up, and a good defense attorney like Michael or myself will find that he made a mistake, did something behind Nicky's back that he wasn't allowed to do, caused a situation that was entrapment, and he's going to screw up that case and every case he ever worked. So I never wanted to work with somebody who wasn't arrested. Now, there's a possibility of the case being totally no pros when he's done working, but I got to have that hammer hanging over his head. So although I know, Michael, it does happen, it's really a bad process. It's a bad form for any law to do it.
I've never seen it. Let me be clear. I've always seen
You're breaking up now, Mike.
Yeah, Mike, you're out.
It happened with. I've
You
only
broke up.
seen it happen. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can
No.
hear you now.
Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I've only seen it happen with misdemeanor pot cases in cars. So they smell weed, they find a little bit of dope, or now it's, the ink cartridges, which technically is a felony. But in those circumstances, they torque kids primarily. And
Right.
I'll tell you where it happens with great frequency, because I'm telling you, I've had dozens of them.
Oh, I know that. I know it happened.
In Weston, they are just notorious BSO for doing that.
Yeah,
And these
they
are, and we're not talking about narcotics detectives like Nikki. We're talking about street guys that pulled him over for traffic.
Correct. Because they're not at Nikki's level. That's what I'm trying to tell you.
It's not even.
It's
It's not even a matter at a certain level. If you're a rogue police officer, if you're pulling a guy over for a traffic violation, you find a bag of weed on him. A seasoned detective, narcotics detective, I say, okay, what do you got? You got a guy that just bought a bag of weed. What do you expect this guy to do for you? To go buy weed?
Right. You're gonna go
again.
Exactly.
I
it's ludicrous,
I just want to say,
but it happens.
I mean, it's a misdemeanor.
So
It probably does. But again, you're dealing with officers. Sometimes intentions are good, but unfortunately, they're a bit over their head.
And can I bring up a pro tip, Mike? Since we like to do pro tips,
yeah.
If that scenario happens to you, where you've got it pulled over and you've got a misdemeanor amount of marijuana, and they want you to work for them, you tell them, "Listen, I will absolutely do anything you want me to do, but let me talk to my lawyer first." And then you call Michael or you call myself, and then we'll decide, because I don't want to rule out that there's a possibility that might be in your best interest. But correct me if I'm wrong, Michael. Most times it's not in your best interest to be cooperating with law enforcement over a bag of weed. Michael and I can help you with a bag of weed. You don't need to cooperate with law enforcement. So don't let them bully you into it.
I'm not a big believer in substantial assistance and cooperation to begin with. I understand the need for it on both sides of the fence, but I don't particularly like dealing with those types of situations. So I have a particular penchant against it. But what I do like is exposing and attacking confidential informants. And I think that juries have a tendency to dislike confidential informants. Absolutely. Just as a general principle. And I think it makes it very difficult for the state to have to effectively excuse criminal conduct or give somebody a pass or a break because it's more important to get somebody else. Again, the logic makes sense. But to a jury who's not generally trained in the law, if it smells fishy and if it swims in the ocean, it's probably a fish.
Here's since you touched on it, let me just say two things. One, I'm not a big fan of cooperation now that I'm a defense attorney. I loved it when I was a prosecutor, and I can tell you something. If generally speaking, Nick, correct me if I'm wrong, if a prosecutor and a cop love a certain scenario, chances are you're not going to enjoy that as a defendant.
Well, but again, sometimes it all boils down to how good your cop is, because the prosecutor is never involved in handling the CI. That's the cop's job. And so law enforcement, you have really two different varieties. You have your professional, very serious officers who know how to handle a CI and take it seriously. And then you've got your, Keystone type cops who are much more lackadaisical. They don't have a choke collar on the CI. They give the CI an awful lot of slack. And what happens is now they're stuck with whatever their CI did. And we'll talk about entrapment. But one of the classic scenarios is you got a CI that's calling you over and over and over and repeatedly dangling fruit in front of your face and offering you and offering and offering you. No matter how many times you say no, the guy just keeps coming back and sweetening the pot. Meantime, if the detective is aware of what's going on, he's going to say, all right, hold on, we got to regroup here because you're doing too much, too long, too much pressure, right?
Well, listen, let's let Nikki in. I love Nikki. And let Nikki.
No, you're absolutely right.
I'm going to put you on the spot.
Absolutely
Nikki.
right. Once he gets rejected, he makes a phone call. No, I'm not going to do that for you. I can't do that for you. You might try one more call or something like that. But you're absolutely right, Mike. It's got to stop at a certain point.
So I had one, Nikki. I had one where I had a client who was a Haitian man who was here on a work visa. He was working at a car dealership, like a, menial labor at the car dealership. And some customer of the car dealership was a CI. And every time he came in, he was always driving a nice new car, trading cars in. This was a flashy guy wearing Rolexes and, talked to everybody. He was friendly with everyone because he was always working everybody for an angle. So he asks my guy whether or not he knows anybody who can get drugs. And my guy says no. And he asks and he asks. He keeps coming back and coming back and coming back. And so there's a documented trail of how many times this guy is at the car dealership. It's like he worked there. He was there so often. And ultimately, over a period of time, some of which was recorded, much of which was not recorded because the officers didn't have a tight enough leash, but there was enough recorded to be supplemented with the non-recorded to be able to show that this guy really pressured a guy who said no repeatedly, no, into finally saying yes. And the reason that he said yes was because of the last tape, my guy said, well, you know what? If I can send that money back to my family, then I guess it's worth it.
Well, that's that, Nick. Tell us, what is that?
No, to me, he should have backed off a long time ago. Are we talking about a large amount of drugs or a street level drug? What are we talking about?
No, it was a kilo of cocaine. It was a significant amount of drugs. So,
either way,
either
way, he pushed that guy to his limit.
And here's the problem.
I agree.
Here's the problem we have with that. Number one, the bigger issues here are twofold. One is the uncontrolled phone calls. That's actually the big problem.
I agree.
Cry,
I agree.
Nick will tell you, it's not a problem. The uncontrolled is because we don't know what he told him. And let me put Nick on the spot. I'll give you an example. Nick, I'm your CI. And I tell you, or you hear me say, I tell Michael, hey, Michael, I'm looking for drugs. Can you sell me some? Is that okay?
We're good.
Okay. How about if I say, Mike, I'm looking for drugs. I need you to sell me a kilo. Is that okay?
We're good.
Not okay. I cannot tell him how much because the kilo takes it to trafficking. And that's a problem. You don't want to tell them. Now,
are you telling me that as a state attorney or as a defense attorney?
No, as a state attorney. We're not really, you can't tell them how much to sell you unless Michael says to me, how much do you want? And then the CI will say, how much can you get me?
Well, let me just throw something at you.
Yeah.
What happens if you knew this guy dealt in kilos?
Still, it's a dicey situation to tell him because remember, so the audience will understand, trafficking becomes a weight. Trafficking is all based on the weight. It's not based on the purity of the cocaine. It's not based on where it came from. Nothing.
But I don't see why it would make a difference for that as opposed to if it were under a trafficking amount, you're still trying to get possession with intent or sale or what have you.
I'll explain it to you because you're entrapping him to a trafficking amount. You can now nail him for cocaine because he was willing to sell you the coke. But the minute the CI told him I need a kilo, now your CI is entrapping him to make it a trafficking.
Well, so what if my guy turns around? What if the guy says, I want a kilo, and my guy says, listen, the best I can do is an ounce.
Then you get him for an ounce.
Okay, but that's what I'm saying. You got him either way.
I'm telling you.
But that's trafficking amount as well.
But this is why I love to work with guys like Nick, because this is what we did. We would sit there and talk, and we would make sure that when the case gets filed, it's bulletproof. Bulletproof. And this is what guys like Nick did. Nick took it serious. Nick wants to read his case law, right, Nick? Nick wants to know what's the right way to do things.
Well, let me ask you this then. What happens if that same scenario, okay, when that informant asked Mike, how much can you do for me? And he says, can you handle a key? Where are we at here now?
Right. Well, if Michael said, how much?
For an amount.
Right. If Michael said, how much do you need? Now we could probably get around it because Michael is implying he can get as much as you want. You follow what I'm saying? That's why maybe it was a little bit of a trick question that I asked you. It's if the CI initially initiates, I want a trafficking amount of time.
I understand what you're saying. Do I agree? No.
Well, listen, that's I'm just telling you straight up. I agree. I know.
See, Ed, Nick,
There's a lot
Nick,
of stuff
Nick
that
and your
happens in the law
fiance
that I
have.
don't agree with. But that's
See,
the law.
Nick and your fiance have something in common. They both disagree with you. So let's talk a little more
This is
about
a great
just
example of what happens in a special unit with a
Yeah,
special.
but these are discussed. They are.
Yeah, we talk, we
generically,
discuss it, and at the end of the day, our goal is to make sure that before someone's arrested, that case can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Whereas a street level arrest, the cop only needs to do probable cause, and let's be honest, most of the times, that's all they care about. They're not looking to make it bulletproof.
Well, a lot of these cases are not prosecuted, being
Right.
the fact that we didn't have enough evidence to it. And as you go through your career in narcotics, you know that, well, I understand it. Sometimes you get a little pissed off about it, but it is what it is. Okay, you're not going to be able to win this case in court. It's not going to happen. Let it go.
And at the end of the day, you got the drugs off the street.
Yeah.
Sometimes a confidential informant is well. Let me put it this way: as on the defense side, when you receive the discovery from the state, a lot of times they don't disclose that there is a confidential source. The police report is cryptic. It kind of suggests it, but they don't come out and say it. They certainly don't list it, as the prosecutor doesn't list CI by either number or name. And so the defense attorney then has the burden of trying to disclose the confidential informant. And there's a lot of reasons for us to want to do that. But first and foremost is to test the integrity of the state's case. So a lot of times, for example, you'll have a confidential source who is extremely valuable, somebody who's able to do multiple kilo deals, right? But you get them on some stupid little penny case or a smaller level case. And now, as a defense attorney, I'm pushing for his disclosure. And I've got a cop on the other side, Nick, saying to the prosecutor, Ed, I don't care what happens here. We cannot burn this guy on this case.
Absolutely.
Because if he gets,
it's called burning the CI.
If Haber gets his paws on this guy, this 1 kilo case pales in comparison to the 500 kilos this guy can do over time.
Absolutely.
Or has done in the past or something.
Yeah, you hit it right on the head. Absolutely. Is disclosing this informant worth losing some really big deals in the future?
And can I tell you something, Nick? Let me interrupt again so the audience can get an understanding of what happens behind these closed doors. When you work with a cop that you respect as a prosecutor and vice versa, it may be that Nicky comes in and says, hey, Ed, listen, I got this case, file it, but I'm telling you right now, we ain't burning the CI. Okay, and I know immediately I can't burn this CI. I don't have to call Nicky back. If they hire Michael Haber, and I do have to disclose him legally because there's certain situations.
It's gone. You dump it.
I just dump it or I try to work it out because Nick already told me we're doing our job, but if the defense does their job, we can't burn this guy. He's too valuable.
So Ed
Nick,
brings up
right or wrong?
No, you hit it on the head. But my question to Mike is, what criteria do you use in reference to the involvement of the CI as to whether or not you can have him disclosed?
Oh, me? I don't care. I move to disclose, period. I don't give a shit. That's my job. My job is to fight for it any which way I can in the hope that it's going to result in a breakdown or a deal that my client can live with or a flat out null pros. So on my end, it doesn't matter. It's your end that makes the difference. It's what are you willing to do?
I was always under the impression, okay, depending on the involvement of this informant, if it was just an introduction to a police officer, in other words, the informant introduces a police officer and he takes over from there, are the courts going to want you to disclose that informant?
No,
so you're asking, right? You're asking about the legal burden for disclosure. So let's break this into the three. Let's break this into the three panels that we have. For you, you never want to turn over a CI. I've never met a law enforcement officer that says, "Oh, I can't wait to give my CI out." They just don't ever. Me, I'm the exact opposite. I want the CI disclosed in every case across the board. Now, Ed, as the prosecutor, is going to tell you what the legal standard is for disclosure, because I'm going to file a motion with the court, and I'm going to put all of my cards on the table and say, Judge, this reason, that reason, the other reason is why. And it may be in the scenario that you just described, the CI has really no involvement other than having made an introduction, and then an undercover has taken all proactive measures, recorded telephone calls, meetings, done everything. Right. So the CI is basically out of the loop. Or it may be that the CI does everything all the way up to the actual transaction, and that there are no undercover officers. There are simply behind the scenes eyeballs, takedowns, etc. So the question is, regardless of what the situation, I file a motion to compel disclosure of the confidential informant. Ed is going to be the guy arguing against me, or, would have been back in the day. But for our purposes, Ed's the prosecutor who's going to say to the judge, yeah, well, Judge, Mr. Haber wants that, but I'll bet there's a lot of things Mr. Haber wants that he's also not going to get, including a weekend with Heidi Klum in the Mediterranean.
I would have loved to.
There you go.
In those scenarios, I would have loved to have said, Your Honor, I know what Mr. Haber wants, but I want a solid gold toilet, but it's just not in the cards.
Exactly.
Now, the short answer is this. Yeah, the short answer is this. If the CI is a witness, and of course, he could be the only person present because he's the only guy who did the drug deal, you're going to have to turn over the CI. But we still make the defense push to say it. And you mentioned something, Michael, and I want to make sure that we're crystal clear. An ethical prosecutor will list the CI if the CI had an involvement. So, for example, if a CI introduces Nikki to the target, and then he does 1 or 2 buys with Nikki, and then later Nikki does a succession of like 5 buys, and the CI never even showed up. Nikki went on his own, got to know the guy on his own, and showed up 5 times to the guy. Maybe that scenario, there's no need to disclose the CI because the guy's already been selling to Nikki for a while. If the CI does the actual buy himself, you got to disclose, and you put CI. If the CI made the introduction but walked away, in my opinion, I would still disclose the CI because it's the ethical thing to do. I know the law is going to protect.
But you can only do that. But you can only do that where you can do that. If Nick comes to you up front and says, Ed, you cannot disclose this CI, you're going to have some problems. I mean, you can override him.
No. But when I say, let me rephrase that. I don't mean disclose as the guy's name. I misspoke. Let me make it crystal clear.
You mean just disclose the fact that there was a CI? They're
just right there on the witness list. It'll say CI.
Right.
That's
exactly.
Or the state attorney's office. You don't know who it is.
But then
you have no idea what's going on.
The point is, when you do that, I file a motion to compel or a motion for disclosure saying, well, the state, very cutely listed CI as a witness. I don't know who CI is, but I do know this, Judge. The 6th Amendment to the United States Constitution says that my client has a right to face his accusers. And if CI is a state's witness, I have a right to talk to him, and my client has a right to know who he is and to question his motive, intent, bias, and reasons for testifying, as well as the quality and quantity of the evidence that he's going to put forth.
Nick wants to say something. Go ahead, Nick.
Right, well, let me
jump
in. Ask you this. To me, it's always boils down to how much involvement was that CI? Was he a witness? Was he just an introduction person? And if that's the case, you should just be able to sit there. First of all, when we have these confidential informants that are working off a sentence, like we talked about before, a cooperating source, okay? They're on contract. A contract is drawn up by the state attorney's office, and this is what it says. You will do this, 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 and that. But also, if necessary, you will testify in court. But again, it comes into, should we reveal this guy?
Right. See, that the bottom line is law enforcement.
That's what it is.
Look, the state attorney has no idea, other than what their cops tell them, the history and the necessity and the value of a particular CI or CS is.
Correct.
They have no way to know it.
Absolutely.
You know it. So ultimately, the prosecutor, if they have any shred of intelligence and integrity, is going to ask, hey, what's the deal with this guy? And then, like I had said, to some degree, and I don't mean to belittle the process, but it's true. To some degree, it is a game. It is like a chess game. And the state is making moves, the defense is making moves. We all know the rules. We all understand how to navigate the system. But at the end of the day, you got some judges who they don't care. They're never going to disclose a CI, right? And you got other judges who just can't wait to grant that defense motion. So a lot of it has to do with your judge. A lot of it has to do with your facts. But at the end of the day, what it really comes down to is law enforcement. And why is the CI important? The CI is important really to the defense of entrapment. That's really where CIs go, basically. So what is entrapment? So that the folks understand, entrapment is when the government, and that means Nick as a police officer or anybody acting at Nick's direction, which we would call a de facto law enforcement agent, meaning a confidential source who's working at the direction of Nick is considered the government. So these guys are out there, right? Those are the guys we need to target. Those are the guys that we're looking to deal with.
But entrapment is when you get somebody to do something that they otherwise would not have done.
So, right. So what entrapment says is a government agent or somebody at the behest of the government, right? An agent or a de facto agent gets somebody who is not otherwise predisposed to commit a crime, So the key to entrapment is really two parts. Number one, did the CI push above and beyond? And number two, was the defendant predisposed to committing the crime? So if I'm facing trafficking charges, but I have prior drug convictions or drug arrests, I'm predisposed. I don't have entrapment. But if I've got no priors, now I may be able to argue entrapment.
That's where the law and the case law says there's a difference. And that's why, because where you have states where the penalties are severely increased for a trafficking amount, right, Nick? Correct me if I'm wrong. When you were working, there are guys that never sell kilos. They don't sell half kilos. They don't sell kilos.
Absolutely.
They sell baggies and 8-balls. That's all they sell. They're not trafficking in heavyweight. If that's what that guy does, and your CI goes up to him and says, hey, can I buy some shit? Can I buy whatever? And the guy says, yeah, what do you want? And he says, well, I need a kilo. That's where the case law says you may have entrapped that guy who normally would not have sold a trafficking amount to sell a trafficking amount, which now increased his penalty.
But, and I understand.
So you didn't entrap him. Let me just finish. You didn't entrap him to selling cocaine, but you may have entrapped him to selling a trafficking amount. So the better process is say, how much can you get me? Now, if your CI says, how much can you get me? And you're stupid enough to say, I can get you as much as you want. Now you're screwed. There's no entrapment for anything because you just opened your own mouth.
But again, predisposition is the key to entrapment. So that's the end all be all. And so entrapment works, if it's going to work, it's generally going to work for a defendant who has no priors, who's otherwise clean. Doesn't matter. You could be selling drugs your entire life. But if you don't have a record for it, then at least you have a shot at going in there. Because the allegations that you've been selling your whole life are just allegations. There's no
or if Nikki gets together with a prosecutor like me and says, Ed, this is a target, that bastard's been selling for years, but we never nailed him. I would tell him, okay, we're not doing 1 or 2 buys. We're going to do 10 buys. Let him come into court and say he wasn't predisposed to sell you a kilo when he gave you 10 buys. He's got no priors, but he did it 10 times in the span of 3 months. Right, Nick?
So this is something I really want the folks to understand, okay? The type of stuff that we're talking about here is advanced law enforcement. This is not
very advanced.
This is not beat cop Leo 101. This is advanced law enforcement. These cases, we call them sting operations. That's where the police will make a controlled buy from a known distributor, seller, trafficker, whatever. Or reverse sting operations, where the police provide money to purchase drugs from somebody. Either way, whether it's a sting or a reverse sting, it's a highly coordinated, very detailed, targeted law enforcement tactic, which is done strategically, intelligently, and with a very well effectuated plan. Multiple police officers. They generally will use audio and video surveillance, and we're going back even well before there were body cams and little brooch cameras and stuff like that. These guys were using directional microphones from garages, across the street to record conversations. Why? Because they knew how important the words were to prove the intent and the knowledge. So it's not enough for a law enforcement officer to get up there and say, well, believe, CI number 147, or believe undercover officer, Detective Delguidice, listen to the tape, watch the video. You've got takedown officers, eyeball officers, perimeter officers, cordoning off areas. You worried about people running and fleeing and guns and all sorts of stuff that may come up. All of this is anticipated. It's very rare that you guys, I mean, I say after 30 years in the business, I don't get too many firsts anymore, right? Most things I've already seen in one way or another. But you guys are the exact opposite when you're on the street.
But
the first thing you're thinking about is, I got to worry about the thing I've never seen before. That's the thing that's got to be in the back and forefront of your mind always.
Well, Nicky was one of the best. Nicky, I'll let you talk, but I just want to throw in because we're almost out of time. I got to tell you, it was a pleasure to work with Nick. Nick was one of the best for two reasons. Nick, well, three really. Nick took it very seriously and very professionally. He was very intelligent and knew what he was doing. And lastly, look at him. Look at him. I put a gold chain on you and you walk around with, you look like you've been selling drugs up north in the east for at least the last 50 years.
Well, unfortunately,
Look how he talks.
I restricted myself as to doing undercover buys only because I didn't really fit the part. You know, it is what it is.
No, you fit the part of the guy that was importing it from Colombia.
I just want to point out the shirt that I'm wearing. And I want to talk a little bit about the effects of regulation, decriminalization, and legalization. You know, I mean, you have places like, I guess it's Oregon, that just basically decriminalized, you know, all sorts of opiates and mushrooms and psilocybin and this and that, things that are pretty much illegal everywhere in the rest of the country. And of course, marijuana in particular, you know, many states have now completely decriminalized it. You can walk into stores and purchase, you know, THC gummies or cookies or cakes or regular weed to smoke, like Amsterdam. They've become the Amsterdams of the United States. And then you have states like Florida, which recognize medicinal marijuana. But all of these things, whether we're talking about regulation, decriminalization, or legalization, have taken a big chunk out of both the illegal drug industry, because obviously once you legalize it, there's only so much need for illegal product. And then it's also taken a significant toll out of law enforcement, because think about all of that resource, all those resources from personnel to equipment that don't need to be used in that particular capacity and can be retasked towards something more significant.
Well,
maybe?
I think that anytime you get the government involved in anything, this is my personal opinion, somewhere down the line, it's going to get screwed up. Somewhere down the line. I've always been believe it or not, a liberal-minded police officer. I thought years ago that they should have legalized certain amounts of marijuana. I still feel that way. As far as it being regulated, I think they can come up with something better than what they're doing now, because I do understand they do have some real issues with the government's hand in it. I'll leave it at that. My point is, as far as some of the other drugs, if you wanted to get into that, Mike, I'm not sure. I'm concerned about that.
Nick, I'm not I'm a borderline libertarian, but I'm not a full-blown libertarian. I don't believe that all drugs should be legal. I don't believe that every scheduled substance should be available on the street for anybody who wants it. But I do believe that pot, marijuana, THC in particular, that there are very compelling arguments to treat it as we treat alcohol. Because in my opinion, it's very similar, in fact, less dangerous, but very similar. And I believe you can have DUI laws and underage laws that regulate, purchase and age and things like that. I mean, that's all reasonable and rational. In fact, there's a system in place. If you just track what we do for alcohol and parallel it for marijuana. But I don't think the same should hold true for cocaine or for meth or for mushrooms or opiates. I think they're in a different category.
I agree.
But, again, like you said, that's a personal opinion.
Right. It is. And it always has been.
Nothing.
A lot of people in law enforcement, they probably don't agree with me, but that's fine. I don't really care. I wish I had gotten a little bit more into the laws, the way they're written these days, in reference to, like you mentioned, sting operations. There's different types of sting operations where we would set up and we would put our police officers out there who would actually sell nickel bags of weed or nickel bags of coke, whatever it might be. And there was also some issues with that I didn't agree with. I don't know if we have enough time to get into that or not, and that's fine. Be more than happy to come back. But
who was that? Who was that Broward sheriff that had that whole controversy for selling dope?
He was making this dope. He was cooking crack cocaine.
He was making, yeah. He had labs cooking it so that he could put
was
it
the
out.
person. I can't remember his last name. So long ago.
You want to talk about entrapment? Was that Navarro? Was that his
name?
Nick
Navarro.
I don't remember.
There you go, Nick Navarro. Yeah, he was cooking it. You know, that's. But I'm just saying that as an example.
Would you say that crossed the line, Nick?
I think Nick went a little too far. I'll leave it at that.
We're almost out of time, guys. But we gotta have Nick back on.
I got a lot to talk about.
But we need you to get a little bit of a better service so we can hear you because you were cutting in and out. I know what you were saying because I've done it with you and I knew exactly what you were saying. But I think the audience missed out on a lot of your expertise and your charisma. And I wanted them to see who you are so you can see what a good undercover detective looks like. You know, go ahead, Mike.
I was going to say, Ed, clearly he's better looking than you and I. So as far as the audience is concerned, you know, a little eye candy never hurt anyone.
Well, next time I see you guys, grow some mustaches, a little beard or something. You know what I mean?
I can't.
I got scruff.
You look, Ed, come on.
I look older. I got too much gray now, man. All this is gray. The whole thing is gray.
You're still good.
The hair's going gray.
You look good. You look the same to me. You look the same.
Exactly. I was clean shaven while I was a state attorney too. Remember?
I would be more than happy to come back. I got so many things I'd like to talk to you guys about.
That's great. Nick, I can't thank you enough for sharing the time you did with us today with the audience. I really hope that everybody enjoyed it. I know we bounced around quite a bit. But listen, it's you know, you could talk about drugs and narcotics and law enforcement until the cows come home. There are classes that are based on this that last a semester long, and they still don't cover the topic.
All right.
So we appreciate you. We're grateful for you, and I don't know when we can continue this conversation, but as soon as we can arrange to do it, we'll be happy to do so.
It'd be my pleasure to come back, guys. I had a good time.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you so much. Good to see you, bro.
It's always a pleasure seeing you.
All right, guys. Let me say to the audience, thank you very much for watching episode 14. Hopefully next week we'll be back with episode 15. And on behalf of both Ed and myself, we're looking forward to being back at your service next week. Thank you all very, very much.